In this episode, I am once again joined by Dr. Julian Schott, Indologist and Tibetologist, trained at institutions such as the renowned Center for the Study of Manuscript Culture at the University of Hamburg. In the first section of this episode, Dr. Schott discusses the idea that Buddhist studies as an academic discipline is in decline, with meagre enrollment, falling standards, and the de-emphasis on philology and mastery of the tradition's scriptural languages. Dr. Schott also reflects on the skills and attitudes that make a good scholar. For the rest of this episode, Dr. Schott pulls back the curtain of the life of a philologist and discusses his re-edition of Indrabhūtis Jñānasiddhi, an in-depth study of its Indian origins and early tradition within the Indo-Tibetan Mahāmudrā Teachings. Details the philological process of reconstructing this important text and explains the pathway from the inception of the idea to obtaining funding to eventual publication. Dr. Schott also remarks on the early Tantric tradition in India, compares its characteristics to later Tantric forms such as the Yogini Tantras of India and Tibet, and shares some surprising insights from Indrabhūti's texts on attaining siddhi and enlightenment. So without further ado, Dr. Julian Schott. Dr. Julian Schott, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be back.
I'm so delighted to be talking with you again, and perhaps I ought to begin by congratulating you on your recent appointment at the University of Vienna.
Thanks. That's very kind.
The University of Vienna is extremely prestigious and wonderful. A wonderful appointment this is for you. So could you say a little bit about what it is that has happened?
Yeah, well, there was a change for the holder of the chair in Tibetology, and they needed a new assistant to the professor. And I applied, and I was accepted, which is very nice because I think that Vienna, together with 2 or 3 other places, perhaps remains one of these, let's say, stronghold of classical European education in terms of classical philology and the subjects I have been taught and trying to maintain. So I am very happy that I'm given the chance to do this while at the same time trying to help fostering the wealth of the department in Buddhist studies as such, which is a great contemporary challenge, I suppose. I mean, in other words, or in simple words, that philology can be helpful even for people who might not think that it could be so.
I'm very curious, and I don't expect this to be an exhaustive list, but I'm very curious, what are the other 2 or 3 places that you had in mind when you mentioned University of Vienna is up there? What are the 2 or 3 of the other places that in your mind still have that kind of standard?
I think there is probably Hamburg, there Paris, maybe not in terms of Sanskrit, but certainly in sense of Tibetology. There is Budapest, highly underrated, but absolutely excellent place to study. Then there is Munich. Maybe, I suppose Munich is also belonging there, and 1 or 2 colleges in Oxford, probably, where there is some excellent scholars. But that's more or less it, yeah. And of course, you have like the one or the other expert here or there, yeah, scattered around the world and places, but not in the sense that there is a strong old tradition.
Very interesting indeed. And what do you foresee your duties and roles to be as the assistant professor there, and what would you like to bring? What sort of vision do you have for the department? What would you like to contribute?
So you see, while I thought how to continue and what to do and how to deal with academia as such, it turned out that a good colleague and friend of mine, who is going to be the professor there, also has the vision of trying to combine, let's say, the strengths of our historic philological education and bring it into a contemporary perspective. For instance, trying to work together with other disciplines for whom Buddhism or aspects of Buddhism are relevant in their studies. I mean, of course, things come to mind such as the mindfulness, meditation research, and things like this. You see, and I think there's a lot of perspective that you can bring in if you know what your colleagues are looking for, and if you're willing to work together with them in a spirit of, let's say, of the mutual interest to explore something that you find of worth, not only for yourself and your small department, but let's say the contribution to not only science, but also the social life in general. And this is how I see my role, or this is what I aspire to be part of if I'm getting the chance. Of course, I do not know what's going to happen, but I will do my best to try be part of something that I think has the potential to provide some valuable stuff.
Yes, well, I'll repeat my congratulations. It's a wonderful appointment for you. And I think also a great choice by University of Vienna. I think they'll be very enriched by your being there. Fantastic. Now, there are many things that I wish to discuss with you today. We were talking a bit before about what some of them might be. And I'd like to ask you about the life of a scholar in your field. But first of all, there are just a couple of things that you've brought up there that perhaps we could pick up on. You're pointing to a few institutions there which you consider to be of a certain standard. And you mentioned the word old, a kind of old style that you're associating here with some sort of high standard or a way of working. And one of the things that we had discussed talking about today was Buddhist studies in general, or Indology in general, perhaps, in universities in Europe and America and places like that. The state, if you like, of a discipline. And you've, I think, hinted there at a sort of bifurcation between two different general approaches, the sort of approach that you're following at University of Vienna and other places, you listed some, and another kind of approach, it seems, presumably that's going on in most other places. What would you, if I was to ask you to reflect on the state of Buddhist studies as a field or a discipline or whatever the word might be, or Indology in general, or however we ought to think of it, how would you reflect on that? Do you see, as some do, as many do, a decline?
Yes. Short answer is yes. And I think, how can we see this? You see the number of students everywhere is getting less and less. Departments have the tendency to be closed rather than to be opened. And publications seem to be of a generally lower standard than they used to be, simply given the pressure of time and lack of education in primary language studies, which in my view still remains of a paramount importance. This does not mean, not to get me wrong, that other things are not also important and that it's not good to have them. But for instance, if you want to do, let's say, meditation research or mindfulness, and you do not even know how the states that you're supposed to be experiencing in one or the other practice are to be described, how are these to be defined, etc., simply because you're not able to read any primary text, then I wonder sometimes, how are people to know what they're looking for? Just to give a random example. So I think there you can really see a decline, and also there generally seem to be less willingness to do, let's say, hard work, in the sense that you're trying to devote yourself to something, and are not satisfied with, let's say, getting a good grade in a course, in a BA or MA or whatever it be, because you see that the thing itself simply requires more of you than to follow a BA curricula and then to expect that you really can do anything. Not to say that I can do everything, not at all, but at least I know my place. Let's say it like this. Yeah.
You've cited several things there: fall off of attendance, a decline in primary language competency, or at least a de-emphasizing of that. What do you think is behind Well, what are the
Mm.
causes, I suppose, is the causes and conditions, if we were to say it like that. What do you think the causes and conditions are of
Mhm.
this? And from where have we fallen?
I think the primary cause for this being the idea that a certain productivity or results can be measured in things or numbers or money. Meaning that there does not seem to be much appreciation for someone who, for the sake of exploring something, gets the chance to explore it, knowing that not actually knowing if it will be of benefit or not. Yeah? So to say, the scientific curiosity to do something for the sake of doing it and giving somebody who has proven to to be worthy of be giving a chance to just explore something, but to need to argue for some kind of, let's say, the need to substantiate what you're doing as something that is of great benefit for the society, for interdisciplinary research, for whatever contemporary things that people might think about. In other words, what you need, what you're doing should be, in some sense, it should be en vogue, it should be kind of sexy, it should, deliver everything that we consider nowadays to be worth achieving. But when we think about philosophy or philology, for that matter, or maybe other studies that go into this direction, there it's not always obvious what this result might be. And because it is difficult to grasp and somewhat not so easy to argue for in a way that seems immediately persuasive, like you cannot, I think it's difficult to give somebody a good elevator pitch of why to edit Jnānasiddhi. So somebody who's an outsider, let's say. Yeah? And I think because of these two things, things are driven by money and controlled by institutions who are actually often outsiders to the discipline you're working in, combined with the short living of positions and the difficulty to acquire funding, how it happens in academia. People are asked to produce more and more in less and less time, and positions, or the duration of positions growing smaller and smaller and smaller. All of these factors combined seem to make it difficult to devote yourself to something that's possibly a lifelong journey. And it seems to me that in the past, there have been more such possibilities. And generally, I think also that the study of languages was considered to be of a greater value. But I think that probably this is a question to be asked somebody who is in the business a little bit longer than me, somebody who could actually see this happening in their lifetime. There must be a couple of them. And I know that there is a couple of interesting articles written about this. I mean, you remember the one from Pollock, for instance, yeah? He wrote about this. Huh?
Yes.
Right.
I wonder then also, what were if we stick with causes and conditions, what were the causes and conditions of the flourishing of this discipline at the time it did? Late 1800s, or 1800s, early 1900s, early 1900s, that sort of period, I think. I wonder what the causes and conditions of that flourishing were.
Yeah, it seems that the old aristocracies, they had slightly different approach to education, so it seems. I mean, I have to smile about this because I think this is a little bit slippery slope. This whole discussion, right? Because many people will think about that imperialism was exclusively bad, isn't it? Yeah? On the other hand, you can see that many of the achievements that have been made could only be made on account of the explorations of these people. And I do not want to say it was good or bad or whatever it was. I'm just saying that there seemed to have been in these areas, in these times, a certain appreciation for acquiring knowledge for the sake of acquiring it. And whether what precisely the interests of the individual are, I do not want to dare to say or even go into that, because, I cannot read dead people's minds. I'm sure that many people will say it is a form of cultural appropriation. They were looking down on others, like they devoted their lives to study something only to prove that their culture is superior, or whatever motives it might be that people have in mind there. But there is still this one thing that is undeniable, is that people were given the opportunity to devote themselves to study something foreign and devote their lives to this. And this is certainly something that nowadays does not seem to be so easy. I mean, how should I justify that I study something without that I actually know precisely what is the value of me studying this, besides that I maybe figure out something, that I add something to the collective, let's say, to the collective accomplishments of documenting something, so that others, might reflect on that, might learn something, whatever it may be, for the sake of documentation, for instance. But this kind of, that you study something for the sake of studying it, because it gives you joy, or because the language is beautiful, or just because the topic is interesting and it might have something to offer, this simple idea does not seem to be reason enough to do something. And then, of course, somebody would say, yeah, I mean, what should you do with Sanskrit or Tibetan? Why doing this? Yeah, why translating something? Like, what is the point of it? What does it contribute? Yeah, and how does my department earn from this? And how many, and look what we have to pay you as a teacher. Yeah, and how many students do you have? Yeah, what is it all worth? Yeah, in monetary terms, of course, then you're always almost one of the last in the food chain, almost always. And this is, I think, part of the decline. Things are not supported for the sake of maintaining a field of study where many things are unexplored, and to do it just for that sake. I do not know if I'm phrasing myself so clearly, but I guess you get what I'm hinting at. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's very interesting what you're saying.
You see, for instance, I mean, if we suppose that you go to university not out of the interest to study something exotic for the sake of doing it out of interest, but let's say you go there, and you going there should contribute to the general economics, meaning you should get a job. There must be something for you to do, and you're at least that you're studying there together with your peers, that should be enough to sustain the university, and also to create some income on top of that. And I think when universities are run more and more like corporations, which they do, then of course you're looking for seminars where you have a lot of attendances, right? I mean, the best thing, of course, is like you have the hall full and only one teacher and one tutor. So, but in order to do this, I cannot ask of them too much, because the more I ask of them, the fewer will attend, isn't it? So this is then why people rather want to have me, of course, like, I don't know, Buddhism and film, yeah, contemporary Buddhism, the role of women in Buddhism, Buddhism and vegetarianism, Buddhism and globalism, yeah? Buddhism and whatever not, because it sounds kind of contemporarily nice. Everybody knows the Dalai Lama, seems to be some good virtues out there, so we try to bring it into context. Right, but if I keep on talking like this, I will just repeat one superficial thing that people anyhow already know. And by doing so, in some sense, I could say I just repeat assumptions and biases, and probably I also foster some of them, and then people go out like everywhere and think I know what X is, I know what Y is, and I actually do not really need to make any effort in order to figure anything out. It's all very easy, and that's the world, right? And frankly, I do not know where this attitude comes from. I really have no idea. I just observe that it is like this, like the courses always should be easy. Never ask too much of a student, and when they do not get a good grade, then can you see that they somehow get a better grade, because otherwise the student might be unhappy. And, like in my world, I do not understand all of this well-being, to be frank, because I'm wondering about what is it that we are actually doing there. And I thought we are there to learn something from one another, from each other. And this idea that one should not ask anything for something and that everything comes from nothing. And this is really something I have no idea where it's coming from. I think this is, I don't know, this you have to ask people like, I don't know who.
Part of what you're saying there, it seems, is you're saying, well, if it's an educational institution, then it would behave differently to how it's behaving. In other words, what part of what you're saying is, I thought we were here to learn something, and I thought we were here to be, I suppose, educated on a topic, and that requires work, hard work, and demand, measured demand to direct that work. But you're saying that you've noticed that that's not always the emphasis or always the priority. And so one might conclude from that, if the educational institution is not educating, then perhaps it's not an educational institution. What is it then? What would you say if we were to follow that logic and take a fresh eyes? You'd never heard of university before, and you were to look at what goes on in the departments that you're thinking of now, and you were to think, what is this institution sort of, what would you call it if you had to give it a new name?
Yeah. I mean, I have a very concrete feeling about it, but I'm afraid I'm lacking a good term on how to call it. Probably I would something approximating a school, I think might be more like it. You see, like why I'm saying this is that when you put children into a school, it's not really that they come there on their own volition and they choose what they want to engage in. There is just a certain set of things that are probably by general agreement, and in terms of, I don't know, history, however you want to call it, there is a couple of conditions, and then somehow it turned out that there is a couple of subjects that are deemed necessary to be studied, right? And they are different, of course, across cultures and times, but we are there, and there is a couple of things that are deemed necessary, and you put the people there, and the only thing you ask them to is just acquire this set of basic knowledge, right? And once they have done this, they're sent away. And that's it, basically, right? This is the system of a school. And I think at least I didn't really experience school at a place where they say, okay, I mean, what is your interest? Why do we go into this and not something else? So you see, like the idea of a critical, reflective mind is not really so much there in a school. There is a curricula, and it's pretty much non-negotiable, right? And when I go to university, I would expect that, like people, rather than getting knowledge, they are getting tools on how to acquire knowledge. And these tools, they start to use themselves, and they are responsible for this, not the teacher, right? The teacher is only responsible for handing them the tools. And what I think is there lacking in the university is that it's turning more and more into a school, as I just described it. Yeah, I do not know how you would call that. I mean, I guess I know what you had in mind, but I probably not the precise term you were thinking about.
I wasn't thinking myself of a particular term. I was just following your argument, and that question came from there. Well, one might ask, so what? So what? What are the consequences of this? What's the big deal if this decline occurs in, say, Tibetan studies, Buddhist studies, something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is the point. Yeah, I don't know, frankly. I mean, obviously the world keeps on turning, right? Um, the question maybe is not so much what are we losing, but what could we gain if we are not losing it? So this is more what I'm thinking about, right? I mean, in the end of the day, of course, you always can say like, who cares? Yeah, I mean, pretty much our smartphones are nowadays good enough to do the math for us. So why bothering teaching the kids in school? Also, no point, right? There is many things that are in some sense pointless. Yeah, why learning another language? You know, just let some people program the DeepL really good. Yeah, and you just keep on talking to ChatGPT a little bit, you know, in your free time, and then why bother about anything? In the end, I mean, I could simply reply, but of course, like what I would say as well, because it has something to offer. I mean, in the end of the day, why are we learning? I think the answer might be twofold. One of them is for as long, you know, when we're talking in a context of Buddhism or spirituality, I would think that it's always a personal quest. So if you really want to figure out something that you're really truly interested in, and that you have the suspicion, you know, might change something in your life for the better, and by extension also for everybody with whom you're in contact with, you know, then it might be worthwhile pursuing something a little bit more intensive, a little bit more exhaustive, perhaps. And on the other hand, I could say, well, I mean, since contemporarily speaking, there seems to be interest in spirituality. People seem to have gotten to the idea that there is a certain sense of well-being that is not mechanically produced, but that is probably a result of one's mental state. Yeah, there is the positive psychology, and like I said, there is meditation research and mindfulness, and a lot of interest in yoga and all of these things. So to have a couple of people, not everybody has to do everything, but at least a couple of people who acquire enough knowledge to really be able to translate one thing from one cultural context into the other might be worthwhile for a lot of people. So I think there is something to gain. What do we have to lose? Of course, in some sense, nothing. When we function now, we will also continue to function in one way or the other.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think we'll move on from this soon, but I do have another question about it, which you're emphasizing there, learning languages, primary languages in which the texts are written and in the field in which one's interested, for example, Sanskrit, Tibetan, I suppose, Pali, that Chinese, that sort of thing, classical Chinese. What are some of the other important skills and disciplines? And maybe this will start to move towards the subject of what it is a philologist does, and you know how you've been conducting your recent projects. But what other skills do you think are important? If you could build your own, I suppose, curriculum, if you could build your own philologist, your own Tibetologist, your own, you know, of course, language is very important. We've discussed that now. What else do you think is important that might be getting overlooked or might be a little bit in similar decline?
You know, I think I mean, what I recognize the most personally, and this is something that has nothing to do with language at all, I'd say, but it's the general mindset of again, of having a little bit more, what I consider a little bit more healthy understanding regarding what is your place in relation to, let's say, your surroundings and whatever it is that you're confronted with. So what I mean by this is that to recognize that you don't know something, I think can be considered a virtue, because it gives you the opportunity to improve on that. I think this is one of the fundamental things in Buddhism, yeah, that you can, for instance, say, well, to realize that you have a problem, that there is samsara, and that you're unhappy, is in some sense a big blessing, because without such a realization, you will just remain ignorant and never be able to change anything. Yeah? It's like in some sense, you could say that problems are the fuel that keep your car going towards a destination. Yeah. where you then at one point do not need that kind of fuel any longer once you arrived. To use maybe it's a little bit stupid analogy, but first thing that comes to mind anyway. So you see, and I think it seems that nowadays it is more and more the case that to ask the question is already almost similar to admitting that you don't know something, which seems to be considered a problem by many students, almost like a fault. Nobody wants to admit that they are doing something wrong. Everybody is afraid to make a mistake. And frankly, I don't know where that's coming from. But this is also something that I could see changing. And I'm not that old, but already, like 10, 15 years ago when I started studying in the university, and when I see how students are dealing with this now, already there seems to be quite a bit of a change. Everybody is afraid of their grade. Everybody is afraid to answer. And when I say everybody, of course, I do not really mean everybody, right? But as a general tendency. So, yeah, and there I would think that it would be really nice to give somebody an introductory course about the healthiness of a negative emotion towards developing yourself to a more resistant and easygoing person who can see that in the pursuit of trying to learn something, to get hold of some of your shortcomings is actually a good thing, not a bad thing. And yeah, this is the one thing that I really think is tremendously lacking. I had a couple of courses, where people, they will just not ask any question, they will not say anything, and then in the end they come, yeah, why is my grade so bad? I don't know, because maybe if you would participate, maybe then you would figure out what it is that you're struggling with. Then maybe you would figure out some stuff that you can work on, if you would approach other people, if you would engage with your peers, like maybe there is something to gain from it. Huh? But this kind of a very simple, let's say, more moderate and less personal attitudes towards yourself is not such, would be quite healthy, and how to say this? Ultimately also there, I feel a certain contradiction in the thing itself. Like if you have an issue admitting towards that you have shortcomings, then why do you go studying, like that you go somewhere to study something is actually the admission of guilt in itself, right? In terms of you go somewhere to study something because you don't know. Otherwise, why would you go study? So where is the issue to admit that you don't know something? This feels for me, it's almost ironical in some sense, isn't it?
Yes, I see your point. This issue, which, as I mentioned, was fairly recently discussed by Alexander Arguelles. He recently discussed this in an episode, and it prompted him, these sorts of issues prompted him to retire as a professor eventually and begin his own private academy, he calls it, uncredited, but a place where he can, teach what he knows. And he's a great polyglot. He's teaching all kinds of languages, Old Norse, Sanskrit, Latin, most of the Romance languages, modern, Old English, that sort of thing, as well as various different history of religion and culture courses, etc. That's one move, is to say, okay, what are we going to do about this? Well, we'll leave the institution and set up an alternative situation where an island, if you want, of rigor, maybe, where we can have a different sort of culture, educational culture. Of course, that has its pros and cons, that approach. Others would say, no, we have to try to reform the institution, or perhaps congregate in those institutions that still hold certain sorts of values that one might be more aligned with. You listed several of them. For instance, you're at University of Vienna. You're saying one of the reasons that you're so happy to be there is that it's rigor and quality. So I've proposed two things there, I suppose. How would you imagine this could be addressed, or is it terminal, do you think?
I think it can be addressed by trying to be a good example. This is how I see it. In some terms, it's very easy. You know, I think it's the same with spirituality, right? I mean, when you're an easygoing, chill guy who seems to be dealing quite well with problems and issues or whatever difficult situations at hand might be there on your table right now, and people see you, despite stress and problems, you seem to be kind of at ease and in peace with the situation, you know, and maybe at one point they will come to you and ask you how you do this. Huh? So that's one of the very old ways, I suppose, how you do this. And I think that this is the only way I can really think of it, you know, to go somewhere and to show people with examples that what you're doing has value, and that you inspire people by showing them that what they're learning is for their benefit, and that it's cannot only be measured in terms of positions, careers, jobs, bank accounts, whatever there might be, because intuitively most of the people know anyway.
Well, very interesting. Thank you, Julian. Maybe we could pivot now and talk about your Indrabhūti project. I wonder if we might use this particular project as, in a sense, a case study of how one conducts the sort of work that you do. First of all, I'd like to know, how do you select a project like this to work on? How do you decide, okay, I'm going to work on this particular question or this particular area I'm going to investigate? How do you set the parameters for your investigation? And how do you justify that to, I suppose, grants, boards and so on? What are those sorts of considerations? And then you form a collaboration. You have done that with Dr. Gerloff, Dr. Torsten Gerloff. How do you work that out? And then what are the nuts and bolts of a project like that? What are the steps involved in going through this, what I believe has been a multi-year project, and you're almost at the end of it?
Yes. I mean, first of all, first things first, how do you select something? Well, I mean, in some sense, that's relatively easy in some respect, at least. I mean, in this particular case, you know, it was brought to our attention. I mean, both my colleague and I, we knew of the existence of that text before we worked on it, but none of us really engaged deeper into it. And then, you know, it was brought to my colleagues' attention that there is a couple of materials by which we could improve on it. And it actually started as some kind of, let's say, hobby endeavor. Yeah. So we had this habit to read texts together, just privately, without that we had any particular intention of, let's say, doing anything with that besides reading it. So we did this just for the sake of fun. And yeah, then at one point, we reached a certain state where we thought, okay, like maybe we should turn this into something full-fledged, more rigorous. So we applied. Yeah, we put together an application. I mean, these things are rather lengthy, right? I flew over to him. He was in Thailand at the time. We spent 2 weeks together on work on this application and put like our whatever it is 20-page proposal together, arguing basically for the necessity of doing this again, simply because the status of the text is very bad, and its importance for understanding of the tradition rather great. So that is it, how it happened in short term. So I think the answer to you is, if you have an interest for your subject and you just start exploring, even if it is at random, you will sooner or later come to a point where you see that there is too many unknowns there that have to be resolved before you actually can satisfy your curiosity, on account of which you started exploring something. And this is simply because the array of genres and literature is so vast, and the work that has been done is comparatively little. So in that terms, everybody who is in this field of Indology or Tibetology or Buddhist studies is actually very fortunate, because there is like just so many loads of things, that you can work on that nobody ever has actually looked at. So that is something very easy. And then, yeah, I mean, the more difficult part is certainly the question of funding. So you see, like, we are very happy because in the German Research Council from which we got the grant, they are still comparatively conservative. I mean, much more conservative than I think in many of the Anglo-American institutions, where this idea of interdisciplinary contemporary relevance and all of these questions, and also questions of that pertain to different political and ideological groups, and all of these interests that are at play are much stronger. So there we were actually like quite happy that our project was innovative enough in its own discipline, and it was considered qualified enough to be worthy of funding, and that was enough. But one also should probably mention that that is not necessarily the case. I mean, we were lucky because you will never know who is to evaluate your proposal, right? And yeah, and this is something that is always a little bit like a gamble. Yeah, I mean, if you're good and if you're a little bit above quality, above average, of course, this raises your chances of a success for funding significantly. And yet, this is not enough, because, I mean, those people who are selected are always in a group of other people who are probably equally excellent, and who don't get selected. And you could also be always one of these groups, depending on who is supposed to read your stuff, yeah, and what is this particular background of that person, and who else applied in the same moment for you, or with the more or less similar ideas. So I think there is many causes and conditions that assemble, and at least half of them you cannot really influence by any means, I suppose. So I think it is a combination of being having some merit, of course, but also being at the same moment, at the right time, right place, yeah, and also certain amount of luck. This is how I see it. So, I mean, I could not claim this is just because we are so great. Yeah, that's certainly not the case. Yeah, I mean, we were actually quite lucky that in these days still somebody did give us funding to do such a work. And honestly, none of us actually did expect that it would get through, to be frank. Yeah.
And could you give a sketch of why this subject, why this text, why this reedition? Of course, now you're at the end, so you have an even clearer idea, I suppose. But at that point, what were you setting out to do, and why?
You see, like, I mean, both of us, we are interested in Tantric Buddhism, and none of us had tried to delve deeper into the earlier parts and their origins. And we were just wondering what to do next. We had worked together on some things, and then, this text popped up, and just, shall we have a look what it is? Just because we trust our teachers, and when they say, hey, this might be worth checking out, maybe that's interesting for you guys, we said, okay, let's give it a shot. Let's see, why not? So you could say it is probably in some sense a transmission. Yeah. So trust to the people that have achieved something in your area, and you're sure that when they suggest something to you that it has a reason. So we thought, okay, like, why not? In lack of anything better to do, we just gave it a shot, basically. So there was, at least for my part, there was not a great deal of thought behind that. You know, I cannot pretend that this is following a long-term plan and a deep analysis of many things. It just so happened, yeah, I would say. But what I could see is that these early traditions, they are very fascinating in and out of themselves. And they seem to me to be a little bit something, you know, like different than these Yogini Tantra traditions, everything that came later, you know, into Tibet, and which seems to me a much more fixed set of ideas and practices. And what you can see in this early text is, for instance, that they seem to struggle with others. They seem to struggle maybe also with their surrounding. And you can see that there is something in this text where you have the feeling they are negotiating their way within their surrounding and their times. And you can really get a gist of how this might all have been at the times where not everything was already well established, you know, and nobody would ask any questions or doubt anything. Not everything was totally clear from the beginning. And I think that to see something of a progressive nature, also a polemical nature, also something that's ironical, and that is not, you know, only describing doctrines and philosophies, but which is trying to give you a general view, you know, on something much larger, how to find your way within a world of different ideas, with the developing of new rituals, of new ways of approaching something that already has been, and so on and so forth. So I think to see this kind of evolution and development, to see this progressive spirit, is something that is very interesting. I guess also to understand where some of the ideas that seem very natural might have been coming from. And again, you can see that not everything was clear always from the beginning, yeah? But it's a constant negotiation of terms, and nothing is really permanent in that sense. So I learned a lot by studying this scripture.
That's very interesting to hear you talk about that sense of progress or evolution. Often I think one hears a narrative of these sorts of texts being, in a sense, deposited into the mind of the writer through some means or another, divine revelation, something like that. So it's quite interesting to hear a tradition being, if you like, worked out over time and evolving. What are the main differences that, would you say, characteristic differences between the sort of text you're working on and the Yogini Tantras? You mentioned that there was some significant differences there. What were you thinking of when you said that?
You see, what I was thinking of, that what you can see is that in the development of Buddhism in India, and then when it went to Tibet in these two spreads, and then in Tibet itself, that there is emphasis on different aspects, I would say. And what you can see is, like, there are certain things, of course, that are present all the time, but they are not giving the same emphasis really. And what you can see is that there is in some sense there is a shift of let's say what is considered the proper spiritual program. And I think the more that Tantra evolved, the more it also was in some sense ritualized. And I think this seems to be, to me, something like almost, I don't know how to say this, like a human trait, maybe, in the sense that, you know, whenever something is established and people build on that you do not need to negotiate anymore or argue about why we have this, but you only work with this already is established, and it was not questions anymore, and then we elaborate on that. So I would guess that, you know, a tradition has built up more rituals than getting rid of them in in the time this religion or this spiritual group exists and continues to develop. So, for instance, in many of the Yogini Tantras, or when you also now look to Tibet, you can see that there is simply more of this esoteric setting in terms of ritual that is there. And in the earlier scriptures, of course, you also have this thing like initiation, mandalas, yeah? But all of these things, they are less well defined, you know, and they are to some extent they have not been worked out into a universally existing program. That is not really ought to change anymore. You know, that it was simply not the early times. There was simply nothing as this is how we do it. People had to figure out, and there were different ways of how you start to engage with something new, right? So there was a greater sense of variety, I suppose. And of course, when you look into the later tantric tradition and the Yogini Tantras, of course, like every tantric tradition has their own way of doing things. Yeah, this is not to say that there is not a variety. There is a great variety in the details, but not necessarily a great variety in the general approach. This is how I would see it. And I think that in the earlier scriptures, you can see that there is more of such things. In some sense, they were a bit more, they were a bit more uncommon, a bit more wild, a bit more revolutionary in some respects. It's at least my personal feeling about that.
That's very interesting indeed. And you mentioned initiation and you mentioned mandala. I wonder, when we consider the Indrabhūti text that you're finishing the reedition of, are there any specifics that you have in mind? These ways of doing things that are different from the later tantric tradition? Does anything spring out to say, "Gosh, you wouldn't necessarily think this was the way it was done, given how it's done later"?
You know, the interesting thing in his text is actually that he gives you, that he tries to give you a comprehensive presentation of one topic. Yeah, his topic is, as the title says, jnana. So jnana is, I don't know how we call this. Most of the people think of jnana, at least as Buddha jnana. Tibetans say yeshe, so some kind of untainted, pure, perfected cognition. You know, the way how the Buddha sees and perceives the world, right? Some people say, I don't know, like Buddha wisdom, or maybe gnosis, you know, not in the Christian Gnostic sense, but just in relation to the origin of the world. You know, so some, I don't know how to say this, some primordial, free lucid way of awareness, you know, something like that. Many different ways, I think, of describing that. Yeah. So, and Indrabhūti sets out to tell you how do you achieve at the point how the Buddha sees the world, and he does this by getting rid of wrong assumptions of how to achieve this, and he tells you what is the right view. Then he backs up his right view by scripture, which were circulating at his time, and then he sets out to give you a couple of practical aspects that entails. So that is to say, how the most developed practitioner acts and behaves in the world. And this is his main theme. Yeah, how do you get to this jnana? And you know, the point that he makes often, and this is, I find actually interesting, and this is also why I would call it progressive in a certain sense. You know, he is interested in making it clear what is provisional and what is not provisional, and how the context of Tantra has to be understood in terms of how do I achieve this jnana. And it seems that, you know, there's a couple of parameters that are important, but all the rest, you know, is maybe of secondary importance. And, you know, like he doesn't mention any particular rites or anything like this. The only thing he mentions, okay, you do the standard thing, yeah, you you rejoice, yeah, you confess your sins, you develop bodhicitta, stuff like this, yeah. And there is conventions, you know, like you can meditate on form deities, you know, there is different philosophical positions. Some of them, they have conventional use, but they are not of ultimate relevance. And he goes through this rather quickly. And there is also other practices that are around. There is the idea of great bliss through sexual practices, you know, and there is other states of mind, you know, that some people consider to be able to do something. And he basically rejects everything, and he gives you a feeling of what he thinks this jnana is about. Yeah, so it's a living being who can act and interact with the world, and there is nothing deep, scholastic, philosophic, and intellectual about it, but he just gives you, let's say, something that we would consider a down-to-earth, common sense presentation of somebody who thought his thing kind of through and who wants to give it the correct feeling, yeah, and who wants to reject intellectual debates about that topic, and who wants to set things straight in the sense, so this is how it is and not the other way around, yeah, and stop arguing and making a fuss about things, and do not go into fuzzy little details that just carry us away from the main point, something like this. And this is of course interesting because, I mean, of course, in Tibet, there is also a lot of stuff like this teaching pointing out the nature of mind. Yeah, some stuff that was already there with the Kadampas and so on and so forth. So this is also something that does not have quite an equivalent, I think, in India, this particular genre of teaching. So there is also some progressive to that. So they also use you, and you see that I have this feeling that whenever there is coming up something new, and people might be carried away by all of that stuff and think that doing the ritual for the ritual's sake, you know, is enough, and they actually maybe forget that they do it, and they're carried away by this multitude of stuff, then sometimes people come and want to set you straight and say, okay, do not forget the main point. And little bit like a feeling like this I have now after having studied this. I mean, for sure, there is probably people have awful a lot to say about what else you all can find there. But this is just something that I happen to recognize as something that was striking me.
It is very interesting. And how is it that Indrabhūti suggests one ought to go about obtaining this siddhi? And what's he disregarding instead?
I mean, what he is certainly disregarding is that you are influenced falsely by provisional Buddhist doctrine, particularly that you find in the Tantra. So to give you one example, in Tantra, probably you know this, and many will know this, that we have a lot of systems, you know, in which, let's say, something mundane gets a super mundane touch by being associated with certain qualities. Let's say, for instance, we have the 5 skandhas, you know, they are the five Buddha families, and each of them has a particular quality, right? Each color, you know, in the form skandha, yeah, that you can see, each of these color is again associated with the 5 Buddha families, and each gnosis is the counterpart to one disturbance, and so on and so forth. So when you study this a lot, he could say, oh yeah, then you might get the impression that you know, like everything around you is a pure realm, and you're already a Buddha, yeah, because you're made of the constituent elements, and all of them are actually in their nature already Buddha. Yeah. So then he is just saying, yeah, that's all very well, but I mean, who did ever become a king by pronouncing I am a king? So this is then in some sense his rhetoric to deal with that matter in short terms. And this is of course something that's quite refreshing. Yeah. In the sense that, you know, the feeling is to get, yeah, all of this doctrine is very nice, but it ultimately does not serve any other purpose, than building up a system. Yeah, but this is in itself not really of any relevance. So yeah, stuff like this he is doing. Yeah, he is talking about, like Yogacara, for instance. Yeah, like when we have all of these philosophers, is the mind endowed with aspects, is it without aspects, and whatnot all there is. So she also tackles these things and say, yeah, if it would not have any aspects, and it would be just, in some sense, a blank black state, yeah, how could this be the cognition of the Buddha? Yes, and how could he then distinguish right from wrong, and how could he act in the world at all? Yeah, so he gives you the feeling that although all of these different tenet system and doctrines, you can acquire some knowledge through this, and it can be a means, but it never will be more than that. And again, you have the feeling he wants to tell people, do not carry away by that too much. Don't lose your way. Don't get sidetracked. Do not branch off, something like this.
So those are some things he says not to do. What does he say to do to obtain this siddhi?
Yeah. This is the thing, actually. I mean, what he says to you is, you do what people always have done. Yeah, you develop bodhicitta, you be a good practitioner. Yeah, you see that you're a good student. Yeah, you check that you have a good teacher. Yeah, you do not lose your track. You're not being carried away by fancy stuff that people have to talk. And basically, let's say, if you know your path, yeah, you know how to distinguish what is necessary from what is not necessary, and then probably you will get there. So I mean, in some sense, he doesn't make a big fuss about it. It's more about, in the sense that he rejects many things and then gives you, let's say, some down to earth simple things that you would think they are not super new in some sense. He puts you a little bit back in your place, and at the same time, then he is giving you all of these interesting esoteric quotations from early yoga tantras, where he describes the qualities of the mind rather than telling you. I mean, he tells you how to get there in easy terms, but not gives you any specific tantric practices in order to do this. So there is not like the idea, okay, you do this practice and then everything is guaranteed. Nothing like this. Yeah, he says rather the opposite. Yeah, nothing is guaranteed. If you insist too much on something that's really nothing more than a provisional means. And then I think he wants to give you guidance in the sense that you know where you're heading to by giving you the qualities of that kind cognition as he sees it. And some of these qualities is things that ring many bells for everybody who has read Tantra, that he says, like, I don't know, the mind is pervasive, for instance, it is like space, all of these kinds of things. So it's more like he is giving you a notion, yeah, a feeling. He sets your path, he sets your goal, and then he says, okay, all of this like provisional things that you might find on the way might be interesting, might be worth, but it's not really necessary. And just continue to do your thing. But he does not really tell you what that actually is. Yeah. He leaves that open, and this might also be actually on purpose, because it was not his intention, I think, to say, okay, you do I don't know, the Guhya Samaja system of the Jnana Pada according to blah blah blah's instructions, yeah, rather than having a mistaken view of the Guhya Samaja system according to blah blah blah, according to blah blah blah's instruction, because he is actually an issue in the third path of whatever, like not this kind of stuff, yeah.
I wonder if we might talk a bit about process. So you're creating a re-edition of this Indrabhūti text. One might imagine, okay, scholars such as yourself, you get the text, you sit down and with your colleague and you translate it, and you write that up, and job done. But there's a little bit more to it, to creating an edition. isn't there? A critical edition. What
Yes.
what is that process? Could you say something about what is a critical edition, and what were the specific considerations in creating this one?
So first of all, a critical edition means that you first of all you collect all the sources in which the text is transmitted.
When you say different sources, right there, I think is perhaps something that might be obvious when it's pointed out, but perhaps not so obvious unless one thinks about it for a moment. Do you mean to say that, well, surely the text is the text? What's there to compare?
Yeah. That's, of course, might have been true at one specific point in time, right? No, but how to say this in the best way? So when, let's just assume you write something down, yeah, and I find that very inspiring what you have to write down, and then I make 5 copies of it and give it to 5 of my friends, yeah, and they do the same thing, and then we pass it on, and then it happens what has to happen at one point. Somebody makes a slight mistake, yeah, or some piece of the paper gets a little bit destroyed, you know, or one of the sheets is maybe lost, you know, and then another guy, you know, who finds this cannot make sense of this and rearranges them, but maybe makes a mistake. Or somebody wants maybe to copy the copy I gave them, you know, but couldn't read one word really and thought, probably it means this. But unfortunately, his interpretation was wrong, you know, like stuff like this. So as things are being transmitted, there appear different versions, yeah, simply because humans make mistakes. And then there is also a couple of other things, you know, that can create issues, you know, like, you know, materials are not durable forever, and what not all there is, right? So, and then when this process continues for a couple of 100 years, then of course, we will see that there is a couple of variations. And then also, you know, like this short poem that you composed, you know, and that I gave to my friend, he found it nice. And then he also asked a friend of his who was, you know, capable to read English, but also Spanish, in which he wanted to have it translated for his girlfriend. So then he translated it into Spanish, you know. And then, you know, in Spain, they also find it, you know, like equally fascinating, this little piece of poem, and they did the same stuff, you know, in their culture, you know. And so then people will end up, yeah, in, let's say, 500 years, 600, 700, 800 years, you know, and they will have, let's say, five canonical versions of the poem that you wrote in 2 languages. And then, you know, when we dig around and ask some of the friends, you know, they will see, but somebody has maybe another copy that was not in the canon, you know, which was kept in his family, you know, for some centuries, right? And that is a little bit different. And then we collect all of the sources, you know, and all of the versions and testimonies that we could find of, you know, how this poem went on in its life, in which it was transmitted from person to person and group to group and so on and so forth. So then we have this bunch of texts and papers. And because we want to know what, you know, but what was inspiring, you know, like so much for this first students of Steve, yeah, then we try, okay, is there anything else that Steve has written, you know? And who was this guy who translated Steve's poem into Spanish, you know? And what else has he done? And is there, you know, can we see any, you know, like any techniques, anything that can tell us, you know, something about how this whole process happened? Can we see some patterns there? Is there any other informations that we get, how to judge like which variant seems, you know, more close to how Steve usually expresses himself and whatnot? So then we start looking around, and then I see, you know, like there is a line in Steve's poem that very much resembles a line of Shakespeare that I read somewhere else. So obviously he liked Shakespeare very much. So then I look into Shakespeare and see, okay, now I see that line, it must be this, he had this in mind, and then I start reading Shakespeare, and then I find more things, and then I see, yeah, but in Shakespeare, there is another quotation in there, of some other contemporary poet of his time, and oh my God, there is like a whole bunch of things, that Steve must have in mind, and he was influenced by, and of course he knew everything, that Shakespeare was reading, and suddenly, like a big world opens up, in trying to make sense of Steve James's poem, and so, and then we work our way through basically like this. We collect everything we have, we try to make sense of what is the process that is happening there, and can we in some sense try to figure out, like what comes closest to how did this person express himself, probably, and what was he influenced by, what was he thinking, like what was the stuff circulating, what was important for him. Can you see like reflections and traces of things that he must have in mind in his writing? So that opens up a big world, of course. When you want to understand somebody's writing, it means that to some extent you're trying to understand the mind of that person. A little bit like a profiler, right? So, and when you want to understand the mind of a person, you have to understand the times in which he was living. And you have to understand the people he might have been in contact with. You have in simple words, understanding the mind of a person means to understand the world in which he was living, with everything that comes along with that. So, and then, the addition of a small text, and its translation, of course, turns out to be a study of a entire culture or milieu of people. If you really want to pursue it, like in the best to your abilities. And in this process, of course, it is obvious that there is only that much that you can do, right? You cannot read everything. Of course you can try, but when you have a set time frame and you have a job to do, and you live in this relative world, then you have to make a lot of compromises, let's call it. You cannot do everything to the extent that it should be done, ideally speaking, right? And on the other hand, this brings us a little bit back to what we're attempting to talk about before. Why is it worth doing such a thing? Well, you learn awfully a lot about humanity and human thought, and you learn awfully a lot about what is the relation between the truth and how it is presented, right? Something that a student will never see when the students read an article or a history book is this world of thought, that is behind that, right? They will only see it once they attempt to study something deeply themselves. And when they then again read the book, they will read it with this mindset of caution, knowing the limitations of what can be known and what cannot be known, and where is the limits. And all of this will in fact make you a more free person, less reliable on the opinion of other people, because you will be gaining the tools and methods how to evaluate what you have. And in these terms, scientific methodology is useful for everybody. And this is also something that has nothing to do with Buddhist studies or philology alone. This is a general thing that is a very, very beneficial outcome of such way of studying. And I think that since especially language is something that is almost nothing is most is closer to us than language. Yeah, it's how we are raised, how we make sense of the world. Yeah, I mean, we all think in words, right? And we, in some extent, we even feel through words, in the sense that even though often we experience that something is or lies beyond our grasp, but that then we try to express it, in forms of poetry. We find analogies, like we express ourselves through speaking. Yeah, and this process is also nothing that is, it is not even confined to be able to read and write, is it? Yeah, not even that. So, and I think to see how does the process of a text, yeah, that is just, is the closest expression of language, the closest thing that we have, or that shapes our world and our feelings and the way how we perceive everything, how their information is carried out and how it comes about and how it changes and what people all can do with that, and actually also how much you can be manipulated, is something that I think is almost impossible to imagine the range of what is all covered there. But at least maybe you can get some kind of a tiny fraction of what all is there that makes you up as a being, that shapes you, that influences you, and that builds up your entire surrounding, your civilization, what not all there is, right? And just to even think about it, let's say for one term, yeah, only in the university, and to try to understand what is the influence of all of this for you, I think it can be helpful.
In this specific project, were there any particular challenges in that process that you've described there? This gathering of the sources, this reading beyond them. What sort of challenges did you face in this specific case?
The most obvious things is that the words don't make sense to you. Like you transcribe something, yeah, and you do not understand the syntax or the grammar, something is corrupted, yeah. Then you look into the Tibetan translation and you see, well, I do not really get how this can correspond to anything that we can think of what might have been underlying the corruption that we have at hand. Yeah. So then we start to look around, is there some other expression in his writing where we can get, let's say, some idea from? So to put it in very simple terms, some texts, they reached a level of corruption that in some places is so bad that it almost seems impossible to really have an idea of what was once standing there, unless we would find a really good source that Indrabhūti wrote himself, and that he vacuum sealed, put in a box and stored somewhere for us. Yeah, unless that happens, we are probably lost. And in other words, this is one of the main challenges, that, very often things, they are corrupted to an extent that makes it very difficult to be sure what at all was going on there. And again, this is then something what makes you suspicious, when you see that some people say, this is what the Buddha said, that is a teaching, that is what Buddhism wants from you, and you think, okay, how on earth can they know that? I've looked at the sources, and I have no idea what's going on there, and some people just come and claim that's how it is. The Jñānasiddhi is this and that. Yeah, okay, on what basis? And there you actually can see that where is the relevance of what we are doing. Yeah? You were asking for what is lost, when all the disciplines go away. Nothing is lost if nobody's interested in that stuff. Yeah. But for as long, if people find or think that there is something to gain and they want to use it, and some of these people, they do not want to use it only as individuals who try to make sense of it for themselves and do not want to talk with others also about it, as long as that is the case, you could still argue what is there probably is enough. But as long as there is somebody who aspires to bring something into the world, who find that it is their duty, since they live with others, also to share with others, then I think it is maybe wise not to do so too fast and prematurely. And there might be the relevance.
It strikes me a little that if we're to take what you say seriously, and to examine, let's say in terms of Buddhism or related subjects, meditation, yoga, you've mentioned, that sort of thing. If one was to take seriously what you're saying there and think, well, how do I know what it is I'm saying here about that? In whatever context it may be, teaching or teaching others, for example, or perhaps even just in guiding one's own practice by certain principles and certain assumptions and so on. How do I know this is the case? Well, I heard it from someone. I read it in a book. I found it on a video on YouTube, something like this. It strikes me that there wouldn't be very much left that one could really claim with certainty, or at least for a period of time there would be great uncertainty while one sort of digs around and sees what can I actually establish here.
Yeah, I think the point is then being careful, a little bit, not be too quick. I mean, I gather that, for instance, you, with all of these more than 200 episodes, and you have people talking from a variety of backgrounds, and for sure there is many things where the different speakers you have invited, they would hardly agree on a couple of things, right? There will be many people with many different approaches. So, I mean, then when I think about you, for instance, I would also think, well, you will scrutinize this, you will take the things from each individual that make sense to you after you checked it out, right? I mean, what else can you do? No? And in some sense, for sure, you as the person who listens to so many different individuals, all of them, they have their sense of, what they think is right and wrong, for sure, gives you a great variety of perspective. So, I mean, in some sense, with every episode, I figure that you become a little bit freer person in some regard, and maybe looking at it like that, I would also feel that this is the sense that people can make of this information. Of course, it does not mean that there is nothing to rely on, but at the same time, it means that one should maybe not rely too much on things that one does not really know, and one maybe should step back a little bit and maybe see that one gets the foundation straight. I mean, we often have the tendency to do the second step before the third one, or the third or fourth or fifth step before the first one. And when we then see, okay, wait, there is all of these problems, so maybe I go back to the foundation and check here and get the things straight, and set my base properly, and then I go on curious, but also carefully, not too lighthearted, like take everything, and try to make sense of everything immediately. So, I don't know, something like this, I suppose. Yeah,
very interesting. One thing I'd say, seeing as you brought it up, that interviewing so many people has two things maybe that it's done for me along those lines. Is you use that phrase, putting someone in their place. It's certainly given me a better sense of my place. That's quite a relief, I'll say that. To be put into one's place and to find that it's very simple, very small, relatively speaking, is actually a great relief. And to understand that the landscape, if we could use that metaphor, is so vast with such variety, which is, of course, the other side of finding one's own place to be quite small, opens up all kinds of fascinating possibilities and endless potential for curiosity and investigation. But it does, I find it, to the extent that I had it at all, if I did, it has certainly robbed me of any kind of certainty or expectation of achieving anything in particular, which might sound defeatist, but I don't find it to be defeatist at all. I find it an enormous relief and actually quite liberating, and I use that not in the enlightened sense, but it's quite liberating from a practice point of view, for example, or even an intellectual point of view. Recognizing one's limitations, one more clearly sees, well, what work is there to do within one's scope of capability. I found that to be myself very, very positive.
I mean, I can totally relate to that, actually, what you're describing, because I would put it in the terms that, the more all of the knowns that you thought are there, they turn into like unknowns and uncertainties. The more this is happening, the less you have to hold on to in some regard, you know. And you can say, well, I give it the benefit of the doubt, let's see. But there is not really any point to argue with somebody about something, or is it like this or like that? Should it be like this or like, I mean, like in the end, like, I mean, who am I to tell, you know? Let's just all like relax and then see what's coming down our roads. Yeah. And I perceive it like this, precisely like this, with working on text. Yeah. I mean, already when we start, I mean, we know that we will fail in some sense. Mm? And at the same time, it does by no means mean that it was not worth every minute. Yeah, this is really like two absolutely different things. And this is what I mean with, yeah, what I described with what you took up, like knowing where one's place is. And I know that I'm not in the position to establish some ultimate work there, and neither is my colleague, yeah, who is probably to a much greater extent, I'd say, focused on and able to really properly apply the philologist methodology. I think that's, I probably he would not even dare to argue with me about this, although probably he would, I suppose, argue on almost everything else. Yeah, but probably he would not even argue with me on this on this particular point. You know, like I might have a couple of other qualities, like everybody. You know, everybody has their set of skills and what they can do and what they cannot do. And within that, you know, like we are trying to operate. And when we have a little bit of surplus or our conditions allow, then we can hope that others might also benefit from it. You know? It's a little bit like you know, like in this famous verse of Shantideva. Yeah, you know which one I'm talking about, right? I think this is the second or third verse. I don't know. I think it's the second word where he says, nothing is said anew here. I have no particular skill in composition, and everything I'm doing here is purely to satisfy my own mind. And then it continues and says, and if I'm if I have a little bit of luck, you know, somebody else might profit a tiny bit of it, right? And in some sense, of course, everybody would say, well, I mean, that's obviously an overstatement. This guy is just too modest. You know, but in some regard, you could also think, you know, like maybe he also was just a person who knows where his place is, yeah? In some sense, yeah. And I do not want to say that I want to compare myself with Shantideva, okay? Just to make that clear, that's not what I am. Yeah, I think what I meant to say here is like you do your podcast, right? And I think you also started out of personal interest, yeah, in your topic. And it's totally okay that you pursue this without that in the end of how many hundreds of episodes it will be in the end, you know, you necessarily provided the big truth, you know, to somebody. Yeah? And still it doesn't mean that it was not worth every minute of your time. Yeah? So I think in that sense, I see the philology work also.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, let's, as we bring, I think, our discussion to a close this time, let's bring your project to a close. So we've talked about how you select a topic and how you go about choosing that and so on, and getting the conditions right that you can work on it, funding and collaborations, whatever the case, but setting all that up. And we talked about what it means to produce a critical edition. So now you're in the closing stages of your project. What are the closing stages? What are the last touches you'll do? And then where does a critical edition go? Is it published for a general audience, or is it available in scholarly libraries and so on? What is the journey of a critical edition beyond from the point you're at now with it, the closing part onwards? And what will the journey in particular be for your Indrabhūti project?
So the last question, I really have no idea. When and if and how we ever going to come back to that, I really don't know. The rest, you know, like we produce in addition, you know, the Sanskrit text, the Tibetan text, we translate it, we annotate it, we discuss all the problem in a proper scholarly fashion. And of course, we introduce our work, a little bit about the author, a little bit about the contents, a little bit about the context, the description of the materials that we used, and so on and so forth. And this bulk of a couple of 100 pages, then of course, in the end, it has to be proofread, it has to be formatted, indices have to be made, and there is of course like many weeks, if not months, of this rather cumbersome process to go through all of it, to try to have as little mistakes and typos and inconsistencies into that. And then it will be published in some scholarly series, and that's it. And then it's there, ready for the bookshelf. And of course, if we are happy, a couple of people can refer to it. We made a contribution in that area, and if not all libraries burn down at the same time and all hard drives crash at the same time, then it will also outlive both my colleague Torsten and myself, so that at least we contributed something. Let's say it like this. And I suppose that the person who benefited most from it is probably him and I guess. Therefore, we consider ourselves lucky to be in that position. And as for the rest, what should one say? I mean, we can just hope that that others find use in it, for whatever purpose it may be, as many as possible, and we can remain thankful about that we had this opportunity. And then the rest is not up to us anymore. That's just this small, tiny thing in the vast of the ocean, like half a drop. And that's that. And what's coming next is always difficult to say. Like he will go on to have a different position doing other things. I am as well. And like, who knows if there will ever be time to actually come back to that. I think this is probably also one of these things that are sometimes a little bit difficult or tricky, like you develop really an interest for something and think, okay, I mean, like I think both him and we feel like, okay, now we spent enough time on getting our foundation kind of straight. So now actually there is this bunch of things one would like to actually look into now that you got a little bit hold of something at least. At least, there is this fraction, which you kind of got straight. I mean, not totally, but much better than before. Let's say it like this. And you get an idea. Okay, there is all of this other stuff like floating around. That would be really interesting actually to look into that also. But there is already where it ends. This is in some sense, it's interesting. Like a new universe opens up, and at the same time, that probably no time to fly through it. At least in this lifetime, it will be might become tricky. So, and this is I'm also sometimes myself not sure what to make of that, where it actually leads. I don't know. I mean, I just happen to have this circumstances. Like I said, a combination probably of some form of merit and fortune, I guess. That you end up there, but what it's good for, where it goes, and what happens with that next. Honestly, I have no idea, about all of these questions.
And I'm sure there will be people listening now who'd like to follow this project, and when you do publish it, read it. How best? I'm one of them anyway. How best should that be? Is it going to be in English or auf Deutsch?
No, English. Yeah. I think it will be published in a series in Naples, which is called Manuscripta Buddhica, because there will be a manuscript printed in the back of it. Yeah. But I mean, when it's time, Steve, I can let you know. I'll send you a copy.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Julian Schott, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.